Greetings, viewers. Welcome back to another podcast episode of the 16th Council. We are joined again today by a very special guest, Dr. Reuben, the founder of the 16th Council. And given everything that's going on in the war in Ukraine, in Europe, we thought it would be a good idea to sit down and have another one of our much enjoyable discussions on the security situation in Europe, the energy security, the border security, as well as some aspects of political economy. Beginning with a discussion on how the US China rivalry is shaping European relations versus dependency on US security guarantees and the vulnerabilities that it has induced. I think we should, Dr. Reuben, start talking a little bit about how the defense industry is very fragmented, and that really shows loopholes in the industrial and economic policy that the Europeans are facing and what they can do to probably limit those gaps. And then we can talk about energy security and going forward, how you see renewables coming into the picture, critical minerals, and all those other things.
Good. Interesting.
So, beginning with what we saw recently with the Polish airspace as well as the Romanian airspace being violated by what they're saying are Russian drones. We have seen military exercise that Russia does very frequently with Belarus ongoing. How do you think the security situation in Europe will transpire in the coming few days?
Oh well, it's it's very unfortunate that Europe cannot defend itself, and what we are seeing with the violation of the Polish airspace, for example, is something Europe should have to take very seriously because it is characteristic of Russia to first to do certain things and see what response they get. And there are a lot of things that could have happened here. That situation was not a mistake. Clearly, it wasn't. Mr. Putin is pushing the boundaries for a number of reasons. First of all, look, you are not impenetrable. We can come in. That's number one. Secondly, there might actually have been some gathering of information. We don't know what those drones, went in there to do. So it is also testing how Europe can respond. Would they write this move as perhaps a mistake? Would they just excuse it? And if you do that, you establish a situation that can continue just along that pattern, you establish a pattern. So what we say is that Europe really is unable to defend itself right now. And it's a situation that Europe should respond to. It's not sufficient to rely on defense and security guarantee from the United States, especially given Trump's approach to foreign policy. The US foreign policy of these days have changed rapidly. United States have proven itself, at least in the Trump administration, not to be an ally you can completely rely on, because if something doesn't align with their interests, anything can change. It's quite transactional. We see more of political freelancing, and under such circumstances, Europe would have to come together. The defense industry is fragmented, and the strength of Europe lies in its unity. When Europe stands together, they can achieve something meaningful. They can stand up to China, they can stand up to even Russia, they can have a better say in dealing with Washington. So the security situation isn't good. We also see clearly because of Trump's approach, we have seen changes. For example, Germany, what they're doing, what Poland is doing in terms of defense are very remarkable, showing that there can be a real change. But Europe's strength in terms of defense will have to be a unit, a united front, because Europe cannot completely just depend on NATO or the United States to provide security. But in terms of what the situation is, it is not great. What we have seen with Russia doing, violating the Polish airspace, it's not something that should be taken for granted. You can see that could be the beginning of a new plan. All right, it could be a way of testing to see what is possible, and a way also for Mr. Putin, he can get an applause from home to see that listen, Russia is not afraid. We can get into anywhere and get out without any consequence. We can deal with anybody. We're the real thing here. So it should be a sign, a serious sign for Europe to come together and build a strong security that can defend Europe as a bloc.
So I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the empirics that we are discussing because we've been talking about how, and you said that Europe could not really defend itself given the current situation. Now, how did this come about? I think that's the question that many analysts are trying to answer in terms of how the Europeans were so reliant on American security guarantees for a very long time now, post World War II, that it induced some level of ideological vulnerability, right? Because you are relying on a system of international relations where the United States feels obligated to defend Europe. Now, as we have been saying, under Trump's transactional diplomacy, this ideological based model of foreign policy is completely evaporated. We're looking at a very transactional model where if it is in the Trump administration's or the United States' interest to do something, especially on a military scale, that is only when we see their involvement. With the summit in Alaska that was recently concluded, do you think that the Trump administration sees itself less likely getting involved militarily in European affairs?
Well, Trump would like to remain committed to the defense of Europe because it gives him leverage. All right. But Trump will have to want to also see economic value and economic advantage come to America because of that. So you buy American weapons, you open up your markets, and you cooperate with America in containing China. You see, if you don't do that, then you are hit with a tariff. And because you rely on the United States, then that's the more reliance you are on the US for defense, the more the weapons like tariffs and sanctions can be more powerful. So surely Trump is interested in the defense of Europe, but it's not looking at it from just a relationship alliance perspective. He's looking at it from a transactional perspective, where the United States gains advantages, right, retains its dominance, remains a superpower, because countries have no choice than to rely on them to provide security, to provide defense. So Trump is surely interested in that. But it has to be from a transactional perspective in terms of what does the United States get, all right? Access to your markets, buying American weapons and all of that. To that extent, yes, Trump is very open. And Trump would even want to stop anything. If Trump feels threatened, by any country, for example, building their own defense capabilities, if that happens and it's not handled diplomatically, Trump will hit European countries with very serious sanctions to stop it.
Though that makes sense. And since you've been saying that Buy American might be a factor in all of this, what does it say about Europe's proprietary and its own defense industry? Because we've seen Germany now increasing its borrowing ceiling to increase procurement of European defenses, presumably. You've seen Denmark place an order for Franco-Italian air defense systems for over $9 billion, by the way, which is its single biggest defense commitment ever, over buying American Patriot systems, which is the best-selling air defense system, at least in Europe. So going forward, how do you see Europe's defense industry trying to bridge the gap to the mammoth that the US defense industry is?
Okay, so the thing is, Um, Washington has had a long track record of using financial dominance, export control, and national security to discipline allies, and there are examples. But Europe is not helping because, like as I just said before, if Trump feels threatened, he'll hit Europe with tariffs and sanctions to contain them. So the key isn't confrontation. It is designing autonomy in ways that give Europe leverage back. So here's how I think Europe can walk the tightrope. And first will be to play the long-term game. So if Europe frames moves as burden sharing or the risking, and that's a phrase that Washington is friendly with. If they frame moves to build their own defense capabilities as burden sharing or the risking, rather than strategic autonomy, now that will make it harder for the US to object. For example, an EU rapid reaction force can be presented as freeing up US troops for Asia, not undermining NATO. Now, another thing that can be done is to embed autonomy inside NATO. So you make European defense initiatives NATO compatible by default. So you use NATO standards, joint exercises, integrated command structures. These signals, look, we are investing in the alliance. We are not trying to duplicate it. Also, you can mirror the US leverage with EU leverage. And what I mean by that is Europe still have massive layers that the US cares about. For example, you're talking about the market size, meaning there is access to about 400 to 450 million affluent consumers. The US cares about that. And then you look at regulation. The EU can set global standards that US companies must follow. For example, the GDPR, digital markets. Yeah. So that's something. And then you look at it, investments and intelligence corporations. The US benefits from EU data, ports, and bases. Now, using these judiciously turns autonomy into a negotiation, not a rebellion. So the key is for Europe to understand what it does have and how to use that strategically. And there are ways you can also start reducing the dollar vulnerability. For example, you quietly build alternatives to SWIFT, deepen euro clearing, develop your own chip and semiconductors supply chains. They don't announce it as dethroning the dollar, because if you do that, you're looking for trouble with Trump and America. So you don't announce that dethroning the dollar. You do this incrementally, it's incremental steps, and they will matter more than slogans. And then you pick a win-win sectors first of all, right? And that means you can start with autonomy moves that the US benefits from. For example, green energy tech. You can co-develop standards for hydrogen and EVs, so both sides get scale. And then join R&D, make transatlantic consortia in AI and quantum. There are 51% European, maybe 49% American, not zero sum, right? I'm just looking at ways that you can approach building your strategic autonomy without provoking Washington. So it's something that has to be handled diplomatically.
Of course.
And then,
I'm just wondering, Dr. Reuben, that since we're talking so much about the transatlantic link and joint cooperation, since the ideological reliance has been so deeply embedded in Europe, if a self reliant Europe, as we're trying to call it, is even possible in today's world.
oh yes, the thing is, it can work, but you have to play the long-term game, all right? Because Europe cannot afford to bandwagon with the US. But at the same time, Europe cannot afford to sever ties with America. If you do that, that's going to be a problem. You know, look at the recent US project to punish countries that buy Russian oil, including public calls for very high second-grade tariffs on China and Indian imports. Now, that illustrates how transactional Washington foreign policy can become a risk to European strategic choices. So European leaders face a choice between joining heavy-handed US approach that could provoke economic blowback from China, or charting a more calibrated path that prioritizes European interests. Now, the thing is, the US has also G7 partners to consider steep tariff from countries buying Russian oil, a proposal that many in Europe now view as politically fraught and economically risky. So Europe will have to avoid being an automatic policy taker. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that Europe bandwagoning on US plan to organize global trade against Asian trading partners invites retaliation and supply shocks, the very thing Europe cannot afford. And the second is reflexive alignment blunts Europe's bargaining leverage with both the US and with China as well. So autonomy is as much as a posture in negotiation as it is a set of capabilities. So that's it. Europe cannot afford to drift into a de facto neutrality. Europe can afford that. That means aligning neither with the US or China is a luxury that only countries with full military independence and resilient domestic industry can afford. For most EU states today, the sensible middle way is selective alignments. So you coordinate with the US on sanctions and security where it matters, but reserve freedom to protect economic lifelines and the risk supply chains. Yeah. So Europe will have to pursue strategic autonomy. It has to be a long-term effort. You can't say by 2030 Europe is not strategically independent. That's not going to work. It's critical. So pick sectors that doesn't provoke Washington, as I mentioned earlier. Look for how it's a win-win and use terms. Your priority is not declarations, it is impact. So you can just stand up and say, I'm going to dismantle SWIFT and do something better for Europe. You'll be looking for trouble because right now, the United States still holds most of the cards that Europe does. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's going to be a one-time declaration of Europe saying, oh, look, we are now strategically autonomic, and then this is how it is going to be for the rest of life. Because if you look at it from a case-by-case basis, India is now in the midst of negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU. At the same time, you've got Trump, who is pressuring European Union to impose secondary tariffs on India of up to 100% in the middle of an FTA negotiation. So the mixed signals that this sends to countries, especially emerging market economies such as India, that want to do business with Europe, I think that's really causing a lot of uncertainty in European markets. And this is going to be critical going forward.
Yes, it is. It is. There's a dilemma there. And Europe has got to push for competitiveness. Europe has got to learn to adapt to transactional foreign policy making somehow, because America's security umbrella has delivered decades of peace to Western Europe, but it has also bred complacency. And the result is a patchwork of procurement programs, duplication of national armies, fragile industrial base for high-tech systems, and the Trump's era transactional rhetoric and concrete pressure to pay has jolted some governments into action. I mean, earlier we talked about Germany and their recent amendment to is debt brake to allow higher borrowing for defense and infrastructure. So yes, I agree with you that it's a challenging situation for Europe, but Europe has got to understand that the world has shifted, global governance has changed, and the old global order is not going to come back, you know. And one thing to have the situation as it was in the early 2000s up to the Trump administration is daydreaming. The world is never going to return to what it used to be.
I think, speaking of things that the Europeans have been so reliant on for such a long time, we've spoken about American security guarantees. One more critical element in this conversation, in my opinion, is Russian gas. Now,
Mm.
the infrastructure was present for so long, it was working so well for Europe for a long time. They just did not, I think, prepare for a situation where Putin would turn the taps off and starve Europe much needed natural gas. So, how does Europe going forward make sure that it is not becoming reliant on another geography or another source of energy so deeply, while also maintaining some level of energy security for its own self?
Yeah, Russia's role as a major gas supplier to Europe plummeted after the 2022 shocks. But the substitution story is messy. LNG filled some gaps, Norwegian and some African suppliers filled others, and demand destruction did the rest. But the EU's share of uh, pipeline gas imports from Russia fell sharply from the pre-Ukraine war levels. Yet volatility persists, and some member states remain very, very exposed. So Europe has actually made some real progress reducing direct dependency, but that is an incomplete victory. Energy security now depends on supply chains for renewables and critical raw materials, and those are concentrated in a handful of countries. So balancing energy security, affordability, and sustainability demands honest trade-offs. So rapid electrification and renewable deployments reduce dependency on imported hydrocarbons, but they increase reliance on batteries. Right? So Europe's strategic response must therefore be threefold. The first is diversify supply. That means you got to include friendly partners for minerals, build domestic processing and recycling capacity, and invest heavily in grid flexibility, interconnectors, storage, hydrogen for seasonal balancing. But if you ask me to pick two investments that must improve both security and price by 2030, I would say that the first one should be a pan-European grid and long duration storage, including hydrogen infrastructure, faster interconnection, large-scale batteries, and modular hydrogen storage. Now, this lowers overall energy price volatility and reduces vulnerability to regional supply shocks. The other one is strategic domestic processing. In addition to supply chain for critical minerals, scale up European refinery and battle components plants with aggressive recycling targets. The aim is not autarky, it's resilience. So you want to keep higher value stages of the supply chain in Europe, so geopolitical shocks overseas don't translate into inaccessible technology at home. But both are expensive. The alternative is permanent exposure to external blackmail or chronic price instability.
That's right. Now, these strategies that you have recommended, the way in which they must be implemented is with speed and with a lot of adaptability. Now, the issue that the Europeans, in my opinion, frequently run into when dealing with such situations where they need speed and adaptability is that they're slow. The bureaucracies take a lot of time. The red tape is so prevalent that countries might want to do business with Europe from Africa or from Latin America, but then it's expensive because they run into so much compliance related paperwork and challenges that it is no longer worth their while. So, how do you think that Europe can adapt on this very critical issue going forward?
Now that's the point. That is where institutional reform has to come in. It's got something to do with real impact on you because Europe should realize that, European countries colonized many countries in the past. But what we are now seeing is that Europe has actually been colonized and it just doesn't have that level of it because you depend on America for your defense. You depend on China for your tech and all of that. And you regulate. But you don't have real hard power. So your regulation, you make great policies and all of that, but you also don't provide subsidy that can really drive development, to local players in Europe. So Europe has not been coordinated, and Europe's single strength is their unity in every sense of it.
Right. So this has been a very interesting conversation so far, Dr. Reuben. I mean, the amount of critical challenges faced by Europe right now, I think no other region is undergoing what the Europeans are undergoing at the moment. Any final thoughts before we wrap up today's podcast?
Yes, Ishan. You see, strategic autonomy, it's not an on and off switch, right? It is a program of prioritized capability, industrial policy, and energy resilience, paid for by critical choices. So Europe should not chase absolute independence because that's both impossible and actually unnecessary. But it must refuse the defaults of being America's junior partner or China's industrial customer. The right strategy will have to blend selective alignment with the US on security and an unapologetic industrial policy that scales fast and smart, and a serious funded plan to make energy systems resilient and affordable. Now, if Europe can keep a clear head, showing both reflexive bandwagoning and isolationist romanticism, it will be less vulnerable and more influential. So, in short, stop apologizing for being pragmatic. Start acting like an honest broker with your own tools. And please, for the love of liberal democracies, don't let buy European become an excuse for lousy procurement. So Europe can be strategic and prosperous at the same time.
But don't apologize for being pragmatic. I think that really sums up the strategy the Europeans have to employ going forward. This has been absolutely magnificent talking to you about so many of these critical challenges that Europe is facing right now and going forward, the strategies that they can implement. Dr. Reuben, thank you so much once again for your time. I would encourage the viewers to follow the 16th Council's work in terms of our articles, conferences, and podcasts like this one for European geopolitics and also other regions of the world. Thank you, viewers, for watching and tuning in once again, and we hope to see you in the next one.